As a child, my favorite part of Halloween was the pumpkin carving. At first, my brother and I would just watch our dad do it, since we were too young to play with knives, but as we got a little older, we were allowed to make our own. I was much better at it than my brother, but he didn't seem to mind. He wasn't into the artistry of it as much as I was. I loved it so much that our dad would take me back to the pumpkin fields every few days so I could continue creating my masterpieces. Everyone loved my pumpkins. The neighbors would always say how talented I was to craft such expressive faces. My dad started calling me his little Carver. I even started carving pumpkins for people in the neighborhood. Pretty soon, everyone had one of my famous pumpkins on their front stoop. I remember my dad bragging to one of the neighbors that I could probably carve a pumpkin in my sleep. The Halloween after I turned 12, I got the most candy of any previous year. People gave me extra as a way of saying thank you for the pumpkins. There was so much that I gave some to my brother, which I normally wouldn't do. He gave me a big hug and said he loved me, so I smacked him and called him an idiot. We ate so much candy that we went to bed with stomach aches. That night, I had a dream that I went to the pumpkin fields alone. It was dark and all I could see in every direction were pumpkins of all shapes and sizes. I strolled the rows, searching for the perfect one. A voice from behind me said, "Pick me." So I turned around to see a huge, magnificent pumpkin. It was almost as big as I was and looked ripe for the carving. A knife appeared in my hand and I went to work, stabbing and slicing as inspiration took over. When I was finished, it was the greatest creation of my young life. Brimming with pride, I took a step back and admired my achievement with a satisfied smile. The next morning, they rushed my brother to the hospital, but it was too late. It's amazing, really. Halloween, that is, just the idea of it. Humans, we're intelligent creatures for the most part, but during this certain time of the year, we seem to lose all said intelligence. We crave the need to be scared, spooked, and terrified. I myself used to be one of these people, until that Halloween 3 years ago. Now, growing up, I searched for anything and everything that would scare me. The feeling of being scared intrigued me, that rush of blood from your heart to your head, the sound of blood pounding in my ears. My family seemed to travel a lot now that I think back on it. One town to the other, state to state. I still don't know why we did. We weren't militarily involved. My dad wasn't a traveling salesman, and he wasn't a performer. I guess my parents just didn't like to be in one place for too long. They were free spirits. Or so I thought. Halloween was a weird time for us. My father was just like me. He loved being terrified, even more than me. He even tried being a daredevil for a short amount of time. My mom, now, understand my mom was one of the happiest people I have ever come to know. She was so nice and gentle. But for one night out of the year, she changes to this pale, ghostly image of a woman, drained of all color and life. She always looked scared, constantly looking over her shoulder, like something was following her. God, I miss her. It feels like an eternity since that fateful night. It started out like most Halloweens, my dad informing me of all the haunted houses we would be visiting, and my mother was her usual pale self. As the day progressed, though, my mom began to look increasingly worse, like the life was sinking out of her. Her cheekbones were sunk in like those of a Holocaust victim, as if her skeleton was trying to rip free of the skin that holds it. I just shrugged it off, as usual. That was my first mistake. As me and my dad stepped into the cool autumn air, I felt the wind bite into my cheeks and turn them red. As we walked to the car, I saw my dad fall to his knees. I quickly ran to his side. His face was like that of my mother's, pale and bony, and he was grasping at his chest, and looking around, swiveling his head violently. I asked him if he was okay. This seemed to snap him back to normal. He hastily replied that he was okay and we needed to get going so he didn't have to wait in a long line. Too bad we never made it to that damned haunted house. As we drove, the color in my dad's face returned, but he still looked scared. I asked him what had happened. He just replied that he had heartburn. I, again being my carefree self, shrugged it off. As we turned off the main highway onto a side road that I suppose was meant to take us to the haunted house, I felt a sudden chill creep over me. We hadn't been on the road for 5 minutes before I saw headlights. It was an 18-wheeler for some local supermarket, whose name is lost to me. Now, at this point, a lot of things happen at once. Something or someone runs out in front of the truck. The truck swerves into our lane. My dad swerves, but we clip the truck and go spiraling into the woods that surround the road. Pain. That's all that came to mind after these events happened. The loud rumble of an explosion, from what I suppose was the truck that almost killed us. My leg was caught under the caved-in dashboard. I was able to squeeze it out, but this only intensified the pain. I assumed I had a broken leg, or at the very least a major fracture. I observed my surroundings. The car was slammed up against a tree. The front end was basically non-existent. There was smoke cascading up in the distance, with the faint glow of what most likely was the truck on fire. In the midst of this silent chaos, my dad was nowhere to be seen. As I dragged myself out of the car, I noticed something. I couldn't see the road. It wasn't there. I mean, it was as if the road had never existed in the first place. I don't even remember how I reasoned it out in my head, but again, like I did everything, I shrugged it off. As I hobbled over to my dad's side, I saw that the door was ripped off and thrown at least 15 yards to the side of the car. There was a clear path, though, outlined in the weeds by blood and ripped pieces of clothing. Had someone dragged my dad to safety? I remember thinking this. It was the only logical thing, unless he dragged himself, but why would he do that? I followed the trail for what seemed like forever, almost losing it a few times, like he tried to walk at some point, but gave up. After what felt like forever, the woods gave way to an opening. There before me lay a cemetery, but there was something different about this cemetery, something different from any that I'd ever seen. I felt a rumbling underneath my feet, like the dead were resisting the holds of their earthly prison. The tombstones had no names, but were wrapped in chains. Standing in the middle was a figure. It was dressed in black. Beside him lay my father. I called out to it then. It turned its head towards me. What I saw, I cannot describe, because its appearance did not stay the same for long. 1 minute it was a skeleton. Next it was my friends, then my relatives, then a snarling beast whose name I know not. Then he spoke. His voice was hollow, yet commanding. He gave me a feeling that I can only describe as hopelessness. He told me that my parents had committed great crimes. When I asked him what my father had done, he said that he had made a deal, that had helped him cheat death, and that he had been running from it since then. I stood there, still pondering on whether or not this was a dream. I heard an anguished cry gurgle up from my father. Silence. My father was nowhere to be seen. The dark figure sank into the ground, and with him went my sanity and consciousness. Darkness overtook me. I awoke on the sidewalk next to my house. My mother was gone, the house was cleared out, and nobody even remembers me or my parents. Now here I am in this hospital with the only person in the world that I love, my darling wife, Rose. Please take heed of my story, and know you cannot cheat death. There, honey, it's done, I said to Rose soothingly. Thank you, baby. Knock, knock. That must be the doctor. I walk over to the door, and there stands the doctor in his freshly cleaned bone-white jacket, looking very similar to a ghost. "Tom, I know times have been tough for you and Rose, and over these past few years, I feel like we've all become good friends, so it kills me to tell you. It seems the cancer is terminal." That word, terminal, had echoed throughout my mind. It resonated through it like the sound of glass shattering. "I understand," I said back. "I understand this is hard. I'll give you two a bit to discuss." I turn back into the room and start to walk over to her bed when I hear another knock. I backtrack to the door and open it. I saw a man of average height, gray pinstriped suit and a black fedora. His eyes were icy blue and chilled me to the bone. He looked me in the eyes with a piercing stare and said, "Want to make a deal?" I was 13 years old when I stopped trick-or-treating. The other kids weren't so eager to give up free candy, but something happened that year. Something awful. My friends, Owen, Drew, and I were out trekking for candy when we came to a house that had a big bowl of it sitting on the front porch. A sign above it read, "Please take just one." We joked about swiping it all, but Owen and Drew only took a few each, enough to make them feel like badass kids. I'd always been afraid to take more than one because I was intimidated by authority. Sure, it was just a sign, and it usually meant that the owner wasn't home, but I was a timid kid who usually did what she was told. Owen and Drew explained how the house did the same thing every year, and that people rarely saw the guy who lived there. They dared me to do what they were too chicken to, so I decided to see what it felt like to do something naughty. We looked around to make sure no one was watching, and I poured the contents of the bowl into my bag. The three of us ran down the street laughing and shoving each other. Part of me expected someone to chase after us. In hindsight, I was right to be concerned. At Owen's house, we dumped out and sorted all of our yummy treasures. I tried to offer him and Drew some of the contraband candy, but they refused. I remember Owen saying, "That's all you," and Drew shouting, "I don't want your tainted treats." Granted, they weren't entirely serious, but I was annoyed that they weren't sharing in that responsibility, enough to go home instead of sleeping over. That night, I was torn from a sugar-fueled dream by a hand over my mouth and a knife to my neck. The skin was rough and the blade was ice cold. It was just slightly pressing into my skin, ready to slit my throat at a moment's notice. My body went stiff. I wanted to scream, but then a gruff voice whispered, "Don't make a sound." At first, I didn't realize what was happening. Were we being burglarized? Then I got my answer. "Can't you read, you little shit? That sign said just one. Just one." I'll never forget those words and the sickening smell of his breath. He went on to explain how every year he would catch kids taking 2 or 3 pieces of candy, which always infuriated him. It wasn't until I took the entire bowl that he finally snapped. Why did I do something so stupid? I was terrified and humiliated at the same time. "You like candy, you little shit?" he asked me. So I shook my head as much as I could, despite his hand pressing against my face. He then removed it, still holding the knife to my neck, and proceeded to shove the unwrapped candy into my mouth. I tried not to inhale, but I couldn't help it. I could feel things pushing against the back of my throat as I whimpered and drooled. I started to gag, but he put his hand back over my mouth so I wouldn't cough anything up. I truly believed I was going to die, and I feared for my friends as well. My short life flashed quickly before my eyes. All I could think in that moment was, how could an adult hate children this much? Everything I presumed about them was suddenly a lie. They weren't infallible, and their authority wasn't always law. Fine, so I took all this guy's candy. Did I really deserve to die? As I contemplated this for the first time, expecting to suffocate to death. My father rushed into the room, grabbed my metal desk chair, and beat the living daylights out of the guy. I never loved my dad so much as I did that night. I'm an adult now, and I live alone in a nice house on a quiet street with lots of kids. Every Halloween, I leave a basket on my front stoop full of candy with a sign that reads, "Take as many as you want."